When Admiral Hawkins asked the quiet new commander for her call sign, he expected a joke. What he got instead was the resurrection of a ghost he'd ordered dead 15 years ago. The California sun beat down like judgment, hot and unrelenting, bleaching the parade ground at Coronado until it shimmered like glass. Rows of operators stood at attention, their uniforms immaculate, boots aligned with surgical precision. Beyond them, flags snapped in the wind, the stars and stripes framed against a sky so blue it looked almost unreal. The Naval Special Warfare Command was alive with ceremony, a spectacle of pride, discipline, and quiet arrogance. And at its center stood Admiral Richard Hawkins, the man everyone wanted to be. Hawkins adjusted his cap, the polished brim cutting a razor edge of shadow across his lined face. 30 years of command had sculpted him into a monument. The kind that didn't bend, didn't doubt, didn't age. His chest was a garden of ribbons and citations, each one earned through blood and precision. He knew his men admired him. Hell, he admired himself. The Navy had become an extension of his will, and days like this reminded him why he ruled it so easily. From the observation deck, he scanned the formation. Everything gleamed, everything obeyed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice amplified by the courtyard speakers, "today we welcome a new member to our evaluation command. A mystery officer handpicked from JSOC. The crowd murmured, a ripple of curiosity. Hawkins let the pause stretch, timing his smirk perfectly. Let's hope she can keep up with the best of the best. Laughter rolled across the ranks, low and knowing, the kind born of shared superiority. He could see it in their faces, the private jokes, the assumptions, the quiet cruelty that came easy to men who thought themselves elite. A transport jeep growled through the main gate. Kicking up dust, its tires screeched to a stop at the edge of the assembly. Out stepped Commander Amara Blake. She was everything he'd expected, and yet nothing like he'd imagined. Tall, composed. Her uniform looked pressed by geometry itself. The duffel over her shoulder was regulation perfect, her steps exact but unhurried. The sun caught the curve of her jaw, the faint sheen of sweat at her temple. She didn't scan the crowd the way most newcomers did. She studied it, measured it, as if mapping every potential threat in the space of a breath. Whispers broke formation discipline. "That's her? No way. Quota pick, she won't last a week." The sound carried in pieces, sharp enough for her to hear, but she gave no sign she did. Hawkins leaned toward his aide, Lieutenant Commander Briggs, voice low but deliberate. "That her?" "Yes, sir. Commander Amara Blake, JSOC transfer." "JSOC, huh?" Hawkins's mouth twisted. "Hope she's better with a rifle than she is with PowerPoint." A few officers nearby chuckled, careful but eager. It pleased him. Their laughter was a currency he spent freely. Commander Blake stopped before the platform, saluted sharply, and met his eyes. For a heartbeat, the entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Her gaze didn't waver, didn't defer. It was calm, not defiance, but something worse, understanding. Hawkins smiled, lazy and cruel. "Commander," he said into the microphone, "since we're all family here, let's keep things informal." His eyes swept over the sea of faces before landing back on hers. "Tell me, Commander, what's your call sign?" He expected the stumble, the hesitation, the quick, nervous glance for permission, but Amara didn't blink. Her voice, when it came, was smooth as cold steel. "You'll find out when it matters, Admiral." A few scattered laughs, uncertain this time. The words weren't loud, but they carried, somehow cutting through the air more sharply than his own. Hawkins's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He forced a chuckle. "Confident, aren't we?" "Yes, sir," she replied evenly. "Confidence saves lives." The tone wasn't boastful. It wasn't submissive either. Just true. He felt the faintest irritation, like grit under armor. The laughter died down quicker than it should have. Hawkins straightened, the microphone cold in his hand, suddenly aware of how the sun pressed down on him harder now, how the silence after her words seemed to stretch. He dismissed her to orientation, watching as she turned with the same measured calm, each step deliberate, unhurried. The crowd parted instinctively to make room for her. As she disappeared into the sea of uniforms, Hawkins felt an unfamiliar flicker in his gut. Not attraction, not anger, something rarer, a tremor of unease. He'd commanded men who'd fought and bled for him. He'd seen courage, defiance, arrogance, fear, all of it. But that woman's silence had weight. It wasn't pride, it wasn't attitude, it was the stillness of someone who had already seen the worst the world could offer. and survived it. He turned to Briggs, voice clipped. "Pull her file again." "Already did, sir. Half of it's redacted." "Then pull it harder." As the last echoes of the ceremony faded, Hawkins looked out over the formation. The same rows of perfect soldiers, the same sunlight glinting off metals and metal. Yet something in the order felt cracked now, a fracture invisible to everyone but him. Somewhere, deep in the heat and the silence, he could still hear her voice. "You'll find out when it matters." He didn't know why those words bothered him so much, only that they did, and that when the time came, he would. The ocean wind carried a salt sting those. At morning, curling through the steel rafters and glass corridors of Naval Special Warfare Command, Coronado glittered as it always did, discipline dressed in sunlight, but beneath the polish the mood had shifted. The ceremony was over, yet its echo lingered in every conversation, every sidelong glance. By sunrise, Admiral Richard Hawkins had already ordered Amara Blake's file re-examined. It returned with more black ink than words, a ghost of a record, a whisper of operations so classified even the file name itself was restricted. The only visible phrase was a code, Shadow Protocol, Level Omega Clearance. Hawkins frowned, tapping the desk with 2 fingers. Level Omega, he muttered. That kind of classification belonged to missions that officially didn't exist. He should have dropped it there. He didn't. Pride had a way of confusing curiosity for control. Down in the training complex, Commander Amara Blake was already earning a new kind of attention. The day's evaluation began at 0500. Endurance trials, swim drills, combat readiness. The kind of regimen that left most recruits gasping before breakfast. But Amara didn't gasp. She didn't even sweat. She moved through each trial like she was on autopilot. Every motion efficient, exact, almost haunting. Her movements weren't trained, they were remembered. Lieutenant Colton Hayes, the golden boy of Hawkins's unit, decided to test her early. He was all swagger and jawline, a walking recruitment poster. When Master Chief Carver called for pair combat demonstrations, Hayes volunteered before she could speak. "Hope you're ready to lose that shine, Commander," he said, rolling his shoulders. "No hard feelings when you hit the mat." She simply nodded. "No feelings at all, Lieutenant." The crowd circled as Carver barked, "Begin." Hayes lunged. It was a clean move, textbook, powerful, practiced, and utterly useless. Amara pivoted, caught his wrist mid-swing, and used his own momentum to drive him to the ground in one fluid motion. He hit hard enough for the sound to echo. 3 seconds. It took her 3 seconds. Carver's brows lifted. "Textbook reversal," he said evenly. "Clean. Controlled." Hayes blinked up at her, breath gone. "Lucky shot." Amara stepped back, expression unreadable. "Luck favors the trained." The crowd's laughter faltered before it even began. Something about her tone chilled it flat. From the observation window, Hawkins watched in silence. The same unease from yesterday returned. Sharper now. There was no denying it. This woman didn't move like a recruit. She moved like a survivor. "Sir," Briggs murmured beside him. "She's good. Too good." Hawkins nodded slowly. "Or dangerous." By evening, rumors raced through the barracks faster than official orders. The new commander wasn't just a lead, she was something else. Some said she'd trained with Delta before JSOC. Others whispered she was a political implant, but the version that spread fastest, and most quietly, came from a single observation. She doesn't blink when gunfire starts. That night, while the base lights dimmed and the world outside dozed, Hawkins sat alone in his office, reviewing every fragment of her file. Page after page of redacted reports, blacked-out signatures, and time-stamped mission logs that simply read, "Erased." One line caught his eye. "Subject cleared for containment deployment, 72-hour isolation. All contact terminated." Containment. The word gnawed at him. Containment wasn't combat. It was quarantine. He clicked the intercom. "Briggs, pull every JSOC operation involving biological or chemical containment in the last decade." "Yes, sir." Minutes later, Briggs returned with a single folder, thin as breath. "Most of these were destroyed, Admiral, but there's one. Project Seraph." Hawkins froze. "I've heard that name." He had, years ago. A mission scrubbed from every system, every report, a bioweapon recovery that never officially happened. The memory prickled like static under his skin. He'd signed off on something then, a containment order, but he'd never learned who'd carried it out. Until now. Down the hall, Amara sat in her quarters, the barracks dark except for the faint red glow of the alarm light. She opened her locker, removed a small black case, and unwrapped what was inside. An unregistered medal, tarnished with age. The engraving read, "For those who walk through fire and bring others home." She traced the letters with her thumb. Then, closing her eyes, she whispered, "Shadow Blade, in and out." The words were old, worn by memory. A call sign she hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. The past wasn't sleeping. It was stirring. Outside, on the other side of the compound, Hawkins watched her on the security feed, unaware that the same line, Shadowblade, was printed in faint red ink on the one document buried deepest in his safe, the one he hadn't dared to open since the day he locked it away. He turned off the monitor, unsettled by the quiet power in her stillness. He'd mocked her once, in front of everyone, expecting weakness. Now he wasn't so sure who the real threat was, the woman he underestimated, or the truth she carried like a loaded weapon. And somewhere far beyond the base, a voice he hadn't heard in years whispered over a secure frequency, "Phoenix to command. The shadow has resurfaced." A chill swept through Hawkins's spine. He didn't know what the code meant anymore, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Commander Amara Blake wasn't just another officer. She was the beginning of something the Navy thought it had buried, and the storm she'd bring would make every medal on his chest feel like the weight of guilt. The storm rolled in long before the first thunderclap. It wasn't in the sky, it was in the air around Coronado, in the way people stopped laughing when Commander Amara Blake walked into a room, in the way Admiral Hawkins kept his office door locked now, even when he wasn't inside. Something had shifted on that base, invisible but undeniable. By the third day, every operator, officer, and recruit knew her name, not because of her charm or reputation, but because of the silence that followed her. No one could figure her out. She was too calm, too precise, too familiar. At Aero 600, the training facility was alive again. Gunfire echoing, boots striking the mats, commands barked over the PA. Amara stood on the far end of the range, suited in tactical gear, her focus absolute. She'd been assigned to demonstrate combat clearance drills, supposedly a simple exercise. Hawkins had approved it personally. He watched from the upper deck, coffee in hand, though the coffee had gone cold long before the exercise began. His aide, Briggs, stood beside him, looking uneasy. "She's running it alone?" Briggs asked. "She insisted," Hawkins said. Below them, Amara loaded her weapon, moved through the course, and cleared targets faster than the system could register. The sound of her controlled breathing filled the intercom. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation, just deadly rhythm. When the last target dropped, she ejected the magazine, checked the chamber, and said calmly into her mic, "Range secure." The range instructor, Master Chief Carver, whistled low. "That's a new record." From the observation deck, Hawkins didn't move. "She's good," he muttered. "Too good." Briggs hesitated before answering. "Sir, about that background check you ordered, something strange came up." "Stranger than the classified blackout?" "Worse. Every time I try to access her clearance history, it reroutes through an encrypted node in DC. The source tag reads Valkyrie Division." Hawkins turned sharply. "That division doesn't exist." "That's the problem, sir." For the first time in years, Hawkins felt the subtle pulse of fear crawl under his skin. He didn't like mysteries, especially ones the Pentagon pretended not to know about. He stared down at the woman below, who was now resetting the course. She looked up briefly, her gaze meeting his through the glass observation window. The faintest smile tugged at her lips, cold, knowing, and gone before he could blink. That night, a storm broke for real. Rain pounding the base, thunder rattling the barracks. Amara sat on her bunk, boots still on, her duffel open at her feet. She pulled out a small photo, faded, creased, of a group of soldiers standing outside a concrete bunker. Their faces were smudged by dust, their smiles exhausted but real. In the center was her, younger, eyes harder. The man beside her wore a patch with a phoenix insignia. She traced his face with her thumb. "You should have stayed gone," she whispered. Her phone buzzed once. No caller ID, just a text. "They know you're here. Project Serif never died." Her eyes lifted to the rain against the window. She didn't move, didn't breathe for several seconds. Then she stood, slid the photo back into her pocket, and walked out. Across the compound, the alarm blared. 2 short bursts, 1 long. Explosion. The Western Training Building erupted in a bloom of orange flame that lit the night like a second sunrise. Windows shattered, debris rained across the tarmac, and a wave of heat punched through the facility. Hawkins was already running when the second detonation hit, smaller but sharper, controlled. Sabotage. He saw Amara sprinting toward the fire, not away from it, and for one disorienting moment, he thought he saw her silhouette moving the same way it had in the archived photo from Project Seraph, the one he had never admitted to authorizing. "Commander Blake," he shouted through the smoke. "Stand down, that's an order." She ignored him. She disappeared into the wreckage, the heat swallowing her. For 30 unbearable seconds, all he could hear was the hiss of flame and the crack of collapsing steel. Then she emerged, carrying a half-conscious recruit slung over her shoulder. Her uniform was torn, her skin streaked with soot, but her steps were steady. "Building's clear," she said, coughing once. "You've got accelerant residue on the west side. This wasn't an accident." "How the hell would you know that?" Hawkins snapped, angry because he was afraid. Her eyes locked on his. "Because I've seen it before." For the first time, he heard something new in her voice. Not calm, not authority. Memory. Later, in the dim light of the Situation Room, the senior staff gathered around a holographic map of the blast zone. Hawkins stood at the head of the table, jaw set. "Someone breached our perimeter. Find them." Carver, the Master Chief, cleared his throat. "Sir, there's something else. We ran the surveillance feed. Someone cut the cameras 20 minutes before the blast. They knew exactly where to do it." "Who had access?" "Everyone in this room," Carver said grimly. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Amara stood near the back, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Hawkins's eyes found her again, suspicion warring with something heavier. "You called it sabotage before we had confirmation," he said. "How?" "Blast pattern," she replied without flinching. "Too focused. Too clean. That's professional work." "Convenient expertise, Commander," he said, voice rising. "You arrive and suddenly the base explodes? You've got classified connections none of us can access. What are you hiding?" "If I wanted to destroy this base," she said quietly, "you'd already be gone." The room went still. The storm outside crashed against the windows, thunder rolling like an answer. Hawkins stepped closer, his voice a low growl. "What the hell are you?" Her answer was simple, almost gentle. "The thing you tried to forget." Before he could respond, Briggs burst in, pale and shaking. "Sir, security footage from the West Hangar just came in." They crowded around the monitor. The feed was grainy, black and white, but the figure was unmistakable. Someone in maintenance coveralls, moving through the shadows. The stride was military, practiced, precise. The face caught the light for a fraction of a second. Lieutenant Hayes. Hawkins swore under his breath. "Find him, now." But Hayes was already gone. Hours later, after the smoke cleared and the investigators swarmed, Hawkins found himself alone in the darkened control tower, staring at the last frame of the footage, Hayes vanishing into the storm. He didn't notice Amara step quietly into the room behind him until she spoke. "He's not working alone," she said softly. He turned, startled. "You know something?" "I know a pattern," she replied, "and the next explosion won't be in California." Her tone sent a chill through him. "What do you mean?" he demanded. She looked past him, through the rain-streaked glass, toward the black horizon. Project Seraph wasn't shut down, Admiral. It was replicated. And in that instant, Hawkins realized the nightmare he'd buried wasn't over. It had just found its way home. The base was still wrapped in the scent of smoke when the morning came, gray and heavy with unanswered questions. The charred skeleton of the Western Training Building loomed like a warning, an ugly wound against Coronado's perfect symmetry. But beneath the ash and cordons, the real explosion hadn't happened yet. It was building quietly in every command office, every encrypted channel, every lie. Admiral Richard Hawkins hadn't slept. He sat in his office surrounded by reports that all said nothing. Officially, the blast was still under investigation. Unofficially, the Pentagon was already calling, demanding explanations he didn't have. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched beside the growing pile of classified documents. He replayed the security footage again, frame by frame, the shadowed figure slipping through the hangar, the flash, the fire. Lieutenant Colton Hayes, one of his best men, the golden recruit who'd once called him a hero, gone rogue. Except, it didn't fit. Hayes wasn't clever enough to cover his tracks this cleanly. Someone had coached him, maybe even used him, and every time Hawkins tried to think it through, his thoughts drifted to her, the woman whose file looked like a grave marker, Commander Amara Blake. She was the key. He knew it. The question was, to what? A knock broke the silence. "Enter," Hawkins barked. Briggs stepped in, his usual calm gone. "Sir, you need to see this." He handed Hawkins a flash drive marked with a red phoenix emblem, the S. AIM symbol Hawkins hadn't seen since since Project Seraph. Where did you get this? Hawkins asked. It came through a scrambled feed from DC, only one line of metadata. Briggs hesitated. It said, "For those who survived the fire." The Admiral plugged it in. The monitor flickered, and grainy footage appeared. A containment facility, long abandoned, its walls scarred by heat and time. The camera panned across lab equipment, a shattered vial, and a burned-out insignia on the wall. Seraph Command Site 12. Then a voice, a woman's voice, low and steady. "If you're hearing this, the fire didn't end it. They moved it." Hawkins froze. He knew that voice. Amara Blake. The screen glitched again. Images flashed too quickly to process. Documents, signatures, maps, serial codes. But one fragment lingered. A personnel roster. Under containment lead, her name. Under authorization signature, his. The Admiral's breath caught. He had signed the order that erased her existence. He leaned back slowly, every muscle in his jaw tightening. Jesus Christ! Briggs looked uneasy. "Sir, what was Project Seraph?" Hawkins didn't answer. The words felt like poison. Instead, he stood and stared out the window, where dawn light struck the ocean like glass shards. "Get me Commander Blake," he said finally. "Now." She came an hour later, silent as ever, her uniform immaculate despite the exhaustion that hung around her. The bruise on her cheek was faint but real, a souvenir from dragging bodies out of the fire the night before. "You wanted to see me, Admiral?" He turned from the window. "Don't play coy, you know why. I usually prefer people to say it aloud." He slid the flash drive across the table. "You recognize this?" Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. Recognition, regret, maybe both. "Where did you get it?" she asked quietly. "Doesn't matter. What I want to know is what the hell you are. Every file I pull on you is redacted. Every record leads to a dead end. And now I find this. Seraph, containment orders. Your name beside mine on a classified operation that supposedly never happened." Amara didn't sit. She just looked at him for a long time, the weight of her silence stretching between them. "Do you remember Site 12? She asked finally. The question hit like a gunshot. He did. He'd been younger then, a rear admiral tasked with signing emergency containment directives after a chemical outbreak in an unnamed desert region. The official story said the pathogen had been neutralized. The truth, he'd never wanted to know. "You signed the order to seal it," Amara said softly, "and you signed the order to erase me." Hawkins' voice cracked. "You weren't supposed to survive." "No," she said, "but I did." She stepped closer, her presence cold and sharp as the blade she carried. They sent a whole team in to neutralize the bioweapon. It mutated faster than they predicted. The containment door jammed. Someone had to stay behind to burn it out manually. He swallowed hard. "And you?" "I stayed. 3 days, 72 hours of fire and screams. When the dust settled, I was the only one left." The air between them turned electric. The Admiral looked at her like he was seeing a ghost, and in a way, he was. Amara continued, voice trembling for the first time. "When I came out, your office had already buried it. Project Seraph was declared successfully terminated. My team was listed as KIA. And me, just another classified casualty." Hawkins turned away. "Gwiat." From Arthur Kincaid, subject, Project Seraph, Phase 2 authorized. Hawkins froze. Arthur Kincaid was dead. Or so he thought. Night had fallen hard over Coronado. The ocean beyond the base was black glass, and the wind carried a chill that didn't belong to California. Floodlights glared over the ruins of the western building, but most of the base was silent now. Too silent. In Admiral Hawkins's office, the only light came from the computer screen. The message still burned there, impossible and undeniable. From Arthur Kincaid, subject, Project Seraph, Phase 2, authorized. Kincaid, his mentor, his commanding officer during the darkest years of covert development, the man who'd taught him to lead and to look away, officially dead, buried with honors, now apparently very much alive. Hawkins reread the words until they blurred. Each syllable carried the weight of an old sin clawing its way back from the grave. Down the hall, Commander Amara Blake moved like a shadow through the corridor. Quiet, deliberate, focused. She wasn't supposed to be awake, but she hadn't slept in years. Not really. Every explosion, every burned face still lived behind her eyes. The fire of Site 12 had never gone out. It just changed names. She stopped at the door to the secure data center, placed her palm on the scanner, and waited for the lock to click. It didn't. Access denied, the mechanical voice said. Her jaw clenched. Override protocol. Shadow. Voice authorization not recognized. Of course not. She wasn't supposed to exist. She pulled a small device from her pocket, a wedge of black steel with a blinking blue light, and slid it into the port. The lock blinked twice and opened with a soft hiss. Inside, the room hummed with the low growl of servers. Rows of drives blinked in rhythm, like a heartbeat. She went straight to the primary terminal, inserting the flash drive she'd taken from Hawkins earlier. The Phoenix emblem spun on the screen, loading lines of encrypted code. A map appeared, a live feed of data transmission routes, pulsing lines stretching from California to Nevada, then splitting east toward the desert. At the end of one line, coordinates glowed faintly red, 33 to G42N, 115 to G51, W. Amara zoomed in, a decommissioned weapons testing range, long abandoned. Except it wasn't abandoned anymore. Heat signatures, power surges, satellite interference, it was all there. She whispered, they built another facility. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Every instinct told her to destroy the data, to end this, but she couldn't. The truth had to be seen. Behind her, the door opened with a soft click. Hawkins stood there, still in his uniform, looking older than he ever had. The silence between them stretched until the hum of machines became deafening. You broke into my secure data center, he said quietly. You were never going to give me clearance, she replied. He stepped closer. You found something. She didn't answer. She turned the monitor toward him. The red coordinates glowed in the dark. Hawkins' face drained of color. That's in the Mojave, he said slowly. Site Theta. We used to test drone payloads there. Not anymore, Amara said. They're preparing a field test. The same serum that wiped out my team at Seraph. Only this time, they've modified it. He stared at her. Modified how? Her eyes lifted, sharp and cold. To survive air dispersal. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the servers felt like a storm trapped inside the room. Hawkins finally whispered, that's extinction level. Amara nodded once. Helios Defense owns the patents now. Guess who's sitting on their board? He knew before she said it. Arthur Kincaid. The room seemed to tilt. He's supposed to be dead, Hawkins said weakly. He's not, Amara said. He's hiding behind Helios, and he's using your signature to resurrect Project Seraph. The same authorization codes you signed 15 years ago still open their systems. He sank into a chair, staring at the screen as if it were the face of a ghost. God help me. I thought I was protecting the country. No, she said quietly. You were protecting him. Thunder rolled outside, low and distant. Then her phone buzzed. A single message. Mojave site compromised. Hayes inbound. ETA 0500. Phoenix leading. She turned the phone to Hawkins. His eyes widened. Phoenix, he said softly. That's Kincaid's old call sign. She was already strapping on her gear. Then this ends where it began. Hours later, a black military chopper cut across the desert sky. The moon was a ghost through the sand haze. Amara sat in the co-pilot seat, helmet on, face hidden. Behind her, Hawkins checked his sidearm, his hands trembling slightly. You sure about this? He asked over the headset. She didn't answer for a moment. You asked me who I was, she said finally. You're about to find out. The desert below was a graveyard of forgotten projects, craters, silos, rusted vehicles, half buried in sand. And then through the dust, a shape emerged. The facility, low, angular surrounded by automated sentries glowing faint red. As they descended, they saw the trucks, armored convoys moving in formation, lights off. The operation was already underway. Too late for a full breach, Hawkins muttered. Not for me, Amara said, unclipping her harness. Blake, you go in there alone and... She turned to him, eyes steady behind the visor. You started this war, Admiral. Let me finish it. Before he could argue, she jumped. She hit the ground rolling, sand exploding around her. The wind howled as the chopper lifted away, disappearing into the night. Amara moved fast, low, silent, ghost-like. She slipped between sentries, scaling the outer fence, her body a weapon honed by fire and fury. She breached the side entrance, descending into the belly of the facility. Inside, alarms pulsed faintly. The hallways were sterile, humming with unseen energy. Her boots echoed against the steel floor as she advanced deeper, guided by the sound of distant machinery. Then she saw it, the main containment chamber. Glass cylinders lined the walls, each filled with a sickly green fluid. Inside, something moved, not human anymore. The air was thick with disinfectant and death. A voice echoed through the intercom. "Welcome back, Shadowblade." Her blood ran cold. The glass observation deck above flickered to life, and there he stood, Arthur Kincaid, older but unmistakable, silver hair gleaming under the sterile lights. "Kincaid," she breathed. "You survived," he said, smiling faintly. "I always knew you would." "You built this again," she said. "You turned our failure into a factory." He shrugged. "Failure is the foundation of progress. You killed them. I evolved them." The words hit like a slap. She raised her weapon, but the chamber lights flared blindingly bright, and figures began to move in the corridors around her, armed guards, masked, advancing. "Kill her," Kincaid said simply. Gunfire erupted. Sparks danced across the metal floor. Amara dove behind a console, returning fire with surgical precision. Each shot was a punctuation mark in the story she'd never wanted to write. The comm in her ear crackled. Hawkins's voice. "Blake, we're breaching the north wall. Hold position." But she wasn't holding anything. She was already moving. Fast, fluid, unstoppable. Every bullet, every breath, every heartbeat was a countdown. Finally, she reached the upper platform. Kincaid stood waiting, unarmed, smiling. "You can't kill me, Commander," he said. "You need me to prove it ever happened." She leveled her pistol. "You're right," she said, "but I can make sure it ends with you." She fired. The bullet struck the console behind him. The alarm screamed as the containment seals shattered, flooding the chamber with heat and light. Kincaid's smile faltered just as the firestorm erupted, swallowing everything. Amara hit the ground as the world turned white. When the smoke cleared, she was the only one left standing. Again. And somewhere behind her, the Admiral's voice whispered through the static, trembling, reverent, broken. "Shadowblade, now I understand." The dawn was coming, but so was the reckoning. The desert was still burning when the world found out. Satellite images of the Mojave site went public before dawn, a blackened scar in the sand where a facility had once stood. News networks called it a containment breach. The Pentagon called it an accident, but those who had been there, those who survived, knew better. It wasn't an accident, it was a cleansing fire, and Commander Amara Blake was the spot. When the medevac finally arrived, the blast had reduced everything around her to ash. Amara was still on her feet, though barely, uniform scorched, breathing ragged, one gloved hand gripping the shattered remains of a hard drive. The desert wind whipped her hair across her face as she turned toward the flashing lights. Admiral Hawkins stepped out of the helicopter, his uniform torn and streaked with soot. His right hand still trembled from shock, but his eyes, those eyes that had once seen her as an inconvenience, were filled now with something else entirely. Awe. "Blake," he said, voice hoarse, "you shouldn't even be alive." She gave him a faint, tired smile. "Story of my life." They loaded her aboard, the wind howled, the rotors roared, and the desert receded into nothing. Just another classified wound the world would pretend not to see. 3 weeks later, Washington, D.C. gleamed like polished armor. The Senate Armed Services Committee had convened in a chamber built for ceremony, not justice. A place where the powerful learned to sound humble. Cameras lined the walls. The world was watching. At the center table sat Commander Amara Blake, the woman they had once erased. Her face was pale, framed by dark hair tied back tight, her uniform newly pressed, but her eyes distant, eyes that had seen too much fire to be fooled by marble and microphones. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I'm rebuilding. The Navy needs an office dedicated to accountability, one that answers not to rank, but to truth." A reporter called out, "And what will you call it?" Amara smiled faintly. "The Valkyrie Office of Ethical Operations." Then she turned and walked down the steps, the cameras flashing behind her like lightning. That night, long after the broadcasts ended, Hawkins sat alone in his quarters, the TV muted. On the desk in front of him lay a single object, her recovered dog tag, the one she'd left behind at the blast site. The inscription was worn but clear, "Shadowblade, for those who walk through fire." He turned it over in his hand. On the back, scratched faintly by heat and sand, were 4 words, "Honor is daylight now." A knock sounded on his door. He looked up, startled. Amara stood there, silhouetted against the corridor light, out of uniform, just human. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Not since Site 12, he admitted. She walked in, eyes soft for once. "You know, Admiral, when you mocked me that first day, I thought I'd hate you forever." He exhaled a shaky breath. "I almost deserved that." Almost, she said, a small smile ghosting across her lips. Then more quietly, "You asked me for my call sign. You wanted to laugh at it." He nodded. "And I did." She leaned against the door frame. "You know why they called me Shadow Blade?" He shook his head. "Because I cut through the dark," she said. "Not with strength, with survival." For the first time, he smiled. A real one. "And now?" She glanced toward the window where the faintest hint of dawn brushed the horizon. "Now, I think it's time to put down the blade." He looked at her, eyes heavy with remorse and gratitude. "What will you do?" Her answer was simple, steady, unshakable. "Train others to see the shadows before they need to fight them." As she left, the early sunlight spilled through the window, catching on the metal of her dog tag where it rested on his desk. For a long moment, Hawkins just stared at it, the words glinting gold. "Honor is daylight now." He whispered the phrase once, almost like a prayer. Then, for the first time in decades, the old soldier wept, not for guilt, but for grace. And somewhere far from Washington, in the silence between radio frequencies, a single encrypted message pinged to life. From Valkyrie HQ to Pentagon Ops, subject, Shadow Protocol, reinstated for field review. The world thought the fire had gone out, but Amara Blake had just lit a new one that would burn for truth.